Maximizing your profit on the river isn't always about how much you should bet, but in certain situations is about the following. Is my opponent more likely to call my bet or bet if I check to him? The standard situation for this ploy is when you have a marginal to strong hand but feel as though your opponent either has you crushed or has missed his draw. In these types of situations, betting the river won't do you any good since your opponent has you crushed, he's going to just raise you, and when he missed his draw, he's just going to fold anyway. Let's take a look at an example where checking a strong hand might earn you extra value, where a bet would be less effective. Okay, so you're playing in a $10, $20 blind, no-limit cash game, and decide to limp in from the small blind with ace-3 of hearts. The big blind makes it 6 to go, and you call. The flop comes ace, 10, 4, and you check. Your opponent, he makes a continuation bet, as expected, and he bets $80. You decide to just call. The turn card, the 4 of clubs. Both you and your opponent check. The river comes the 8 of diamonds. Now, this is a close call as to whether you should bet or check the river with your aces. Your ultimate decision should depend on your read of your opponent. If your opponent is one that doesn't really bluff and you don't think he would value bet a hand like jacks, queens, or kings, then you should probably bet about 120 and hope to get a call. However, most players don't fit that category and would not only value bet a hand like queens, they may also decide to try and bluff the river by betting with a hand like queen jack, a missed straight. Against a player like this, checking will often be the more profitable play, as your opponent won't call your bet, but he may see your check as a sign of weakness and decide to take one more stab at the pot. Now, eventually, your opponents are going to pick up on the fact that you'll often check marginal to strong hands in the river, looking to induce a bluff. But that's also something that you should be able to exploit in another way. If your opponents are on to your tendency to check some good hands on the river, they will now think twice about making thin value bets against you, which could earn you some free showdowns in situations where you're actually going to pay off a bet. For example, you're again in a $10, $20 no-limit hold'em cash game, and this time a player raises $60 for middle position. You defend your blind with ace-4 spades. The flop, queen, 10, 4, giving you bottom pair and a backdoor flush draw. Okay, so you check to call the flop bet of $80. The turn, the 10 of diamonds, and both you and your opponent check. The river, a meaningless 3. Okay, this is a situation where there is little to no value in making a bet yourself. Although it looks like you might have the best hand, you'd much prefer seeing your opponent check the river behind you. Let's say your opponent has jacks. With the 10 pairing on the turn, he can't beat you if you call with a 10 on the flop, and he also can't beat the queen. However, if your opponent bets out 150, you very well might call the bet thinking, he missed a straight or a flush and has nothing but ace high. If your opponent is perceptive, though, and has caught on to the fact that you've been checking some hands on the river that you could have bet yourself, he may decide not to value bet the river since he may feel there's very little he could beat if you did call. See, that's actually where you want to get to eventually. You want your opponents to think twice about making thin value bets against you. Playing small ball is a lot about keeping the pot small, especially out of position in marginal situations. Since those situations are much more common than you having a monster hand on the river and looking to play a big pot, it's in your best interest to have your opponents play cautiously against you on the river. Obviously, if your opponents begin to make this adjustment to checking hands, they may have otherwise value bet. That means you'll have to start betting your own hands for value a little more often since your opponents won't habitually do it for you anymore. I have a real-life example of this exact scenario playing online at PokerStars that I'd like to share with you. Okay? I was playing heads-up with a player who I knew little about outside of him being a winning, aggressive player. Okay? Well, in about the first 30 minutes of play, a pattern kept developing. I would check the river with top pair, middle pair, and he would value bet a worse hand on the river. For example, I would check call a flop of jack 9-4 with jack 10. The turn came a deuce and would go check, check. The river comes a 3, and I checked again, hoping for my opponent to bluff at the pot. He didn't bluff, but he actually value bet his queen 9, assuming it was the best hand, second pair with a queen kicker. Now, there was absolutely nothing wrong with this play at all. That's a pretty standard value bet on the river for him. As you can see, though, checking my jack 10 didn't cost me anything, since if I had bet the river, he would have just called the bet. The money still went in the middle, but my play sent my opponent a clear message. Just because I checked the river, it doesn't mean I have nothing. Okay? I continued to play that style against him out of position, and eventually he did make an adjustment. That's precisely what I was hoping for. He had picked up on my tendency to play cautiously on the river by checking and calling, which forced him to change his strategy and avoid making value bets with hands that he'd normally bet. The adjustment he made actually saved me lots of river bets in situations where I would have called, but didn't have to since he checked. Here is a hand from later in that same session. He raised before the flop, and I called with 10-8. The flop came Jack 10-6. I checked, he made a small bet. The turn was a 7, and I checked, as did he. The river was another 6, and it went check on the river. I showed my pair, and he turned over King 10. Now, this is a hand he clearly would have bet for value earlier in the session, but I trained him not to. The strategy isn't complete, though, unless I also make a minor adjustment myself. Knowing that I've lulled my opponent into checking down marginal hands on the river, I had to now bet my own hands for value at a slightly higher percentage of the time on the river. It's like a cat and mouse game that's played on a regular basis, more specifically when playing heads up. In sticking with the small ball concept, though, you always want to try and tame your opponent into keeping the pot smaller, especially when you're out of position. That generally means that you'll be playing a little cautious or weak when out of position, and that's really okay. Remember, your goal out of position is to minimize loss, while in position, your goal is to maximize profit.